Might as well start myself. Some of you know me well, some of you don't know me at all. Gemma Simmonds, Director of the Religious Life Institute, which operates here in Heythrop. A sister of the Congregation of Jesus, which is an active apostolic religious congregation in the Roman Catholic Church of the Ignatian tradition. So we're kind of Lady Jesuits, I suppose, and have been working for some time to develop the Religious Life Institute as a forum in which people can, whether as religious themselves or as people simply interested in religious life, get a theological underpinning to and develop a more theologically reflective understanding of what religious life is, how it operates, and where it looks as if it might be going. Okay, so when we originally started this course, and this is the second year that this course has been running, we tried to cover absolutely everything. I think our idea was, throw everything at it and see what comes out. And we got some very, very positive feedback from the course last year, but one of the things they said was, really, you're trying to do too much. So the course is to a large extent streamlined and simplified. And one of the first things I'm just going to give you is the outline, which is very slightly modified, and you will see that there's a bit of streamlining if you have looked at this before. 1, 2, 3 there, and 1, 2 there. And at the back of this, I'm also giving you the bibliography. Now, please do not be terrorized by this. You are not in any way required or requested to read everything on here. And indeed, you yourselves may find that there are things that you have read or are interested in that are not on here. And if that's the case, I'm always very interested. One of the things about this class is that this is a good forum for a pooling of resources. So please do talk to us, bring up in class books, articles, websites, things that you've read that you think would be interesting. But this at least gives a basic outline of some of the things that are an underpinning to the course itself, or things that have arisen recently that make quite interesting reading. One date for your diary that it would be good for you to have is February the 26th. That's next month, Saturday, February the 26th. The first person, in fact, on the bibliography is an Australian Marist called Gerald Arbuckle. Jerry Arbuckle is very well known among apostolic religious for the books that he's written over a number of decades on religious life, and we are having a study day here at Heythrop given by Jerry Arbuckle. So we're very lucky to have him. He's come over to England from Australia, and we pounced on him as soon as he walked in the door. So do please, if you yourselves also are members of congregations and want to let other members of your congregation know about this, the advertising is going out hopefully at the end of this week. Okay, so that gives you an idea of where we're taking this. There will be 3 of us teaching the course this term. Myself, Martin Poulsen, who is a Salesian priest, teaches systematic theology here. Some of you may know him from other courses. And Kate Stogden, who is a visiting member of staff. Kate is a sister of the Cenacle. Not the cynical, okay, so she's not a cynical sister, she's a Cenacle sister, and she will be mostly doing the input around spirituality. And you will shortly be receiving electronically an outline of the terms course, so that you can see how the course pans out, what it looks like, what the course content in detail is. I know that some of you are doing this course as auditors, simply for interest, but Others of you may wish to do the written work for assessment simply because it's quite nice to get a chance to write something and you'd like to talk and get some feedback about it. But of course, some of you may also be doing this as part of an MA course, and if you are, you will be doing things for assessment because that's how it works. Okay, and the way that the coursework goes, and again next week I will be giving you details of the coursework, is that there are 2 short coursework tasks to be handed in this term, and then there is one end of module essay of 4,000 words. And I very much encourage those of you who think of doing it to do that on a topic that really interests you. This is very much your thing, and you take from the essay, as an opportunity to do some sustained writing and thinking about something that's really of interest to you. I will have to pass your essay title as acceptable, okay? And for those of you who are not full-time students, it's worth knowing that if you do this for assessment, your assessment is kept in the bank, as it were. And should you ever decide to do any more study and could bump it up to a certificate, a diploma, or a degree course from Heythrop, this will not be wasted. So it's always worth having a go at doing it. Okay. So, having said a little bit about myself, apart from being a religious and all those other things, I teach mainly spirituality here, but also ecclesiology, but do a lot of work with religious, both in the British Isles and Europe and across the world, among religious, trying to help them to reflect on their own lives, the meaning and purpose of religious life, and where God seems to be leading it. And to put it mildly, these are stirring times in religious life. Any of us here who entered religious life several decades ago will know that whatever religious life is now, it doesn't look the same as it looked when we started. And the likelihood is that in 20 years' time, it's not going to look the way it looks now. So this is a very, very fluid time for religious orders. And I feel immensely lucky this year for us to have a Carmelite nun with us who can give us a perspective on religious life from the enclosed contemplative and monastic orders. So it's a very, very wide perspective. Equally, last year in the course, we had 2 people in the class who were not religious at all, in terms of members of religious orders. Neither of them was a Catholic. Many of the rest of the people in the group were Catholic religious. And it was actually extremely challenging and helpful and fruitful for us to have people who sat there saying, well, actually, you know, you're talking kind of to each other. It's a kind of in conversation you're having. From the outside, what you're saying makes no sense at all. What are you actually talking about? You know, so it was a very fruitful discussion. So, you know, part of the fruitfulness, I hope, of this term and this group, which is smaller, and that means that it's easier to have better conversations and interactions, is that, you know, your opinion is valid wherever you're coming at this from, and your questions are valid. And the whole purpose of this course is for us maybe to take some stuff out of the cupboard that maybe some of us haven't looked at for a while, or some of us have never looked at all, and shake it about a bit and have a look at what it's made of. And see if for ourselves as individuals, but perhaps for us as a group, we can re-articulate the reality of religious life in a way that has greater depth and makes more sense. I think that's enough for me at the moment. So perhaps if we could, let's start with the lads, okay, at the back, okay. For once we're going to do gentlemen first. Just a little bit about, you know, your name, where you come from, and why you chose to do this course.
My name's Jamie Carrison. I study on part of the Christian Theology MA here, part-time basis. I chose this course because just because I was interested in the subject. It was relevant to my dissertation topic, which is on John Henry Newman and obedience, and I'm also been very interested in religious poetry over the years, particularly Hopkins. So I was hoping that I'd get kind of insight into that from the course.
Lovely. Thanks, Jamie.
My name is Nathan. I'm a student at LSE, and I'm sitting in if you'll give me permission.
Of course, Nathan.
I teach at a Christian university in America, teach theology, and I'm also a minister in sort of the Free Church tradition in American. And it's been a while since I've taken a course in pastoral theology, and I thought it's something I need for me.
Okay.
So.
Nathan, your surname?
Guy, G-U-Y.
Lovely. Well, Nathan, you're very welcome.
Me? I'm Agnes Miller, sister of St. John of God. Obviously, I'm from Ireland, as you can guess, but I've been living in England for a long time, living and working in England. And I'm here because I just was curious to know what's the thinking today about religious life, just a little bit of reflection myself with others, and to see what it's about today, because like you said earlier on, things have changed so much, they're changing drastically. And I belong to a very small group in England, so it's good to meet with others.
What is your ministry principally, Agnes?
Well, I'm sort of retired.
We all know that sisters never retire.
Well, what
Yes.
do I do? I do different things. I teach English to refugees.
Right.
Visit a prison for ladies, or ladies in there, and things like a bit spiritual work, retreat work, and things like that. Kind of a mixture.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I work with refugees. Yeah.
Super.
I'm Maureen Connor. I'm religious of the Assumption. Have been for a long time, I feel. And I'm just interested to think about religious life. And really why I'm doing the course is because it helps me to sort of knock my ideas against other people. I find I just go around in circles on my own, so it is really helpful to be with a group. I did a couple of years working with Gemma in the Religious Life Institute, which was great. My congregation is Augustinian, and it sort of has monastic overtones to it, so it is mixed. So it comes in differently from the Ignatian tradition in a way.
Thank you. Maureen was our project manager, without whom the project could not have been managed. So it's lovely to see her on the receiving end rather than on the very generous giving end. Okay.
I'm Bernadette McCall, and I'm originally from Glasgow. I have worked for the last 30 years since I was professed as a Sister of Nazareth. I've worked in Ireland as a nurse. And I've recently come to live in London to take up some work in formation, and because I had this change in ministry, I thought I better learn something more about it.
Good thinking, Bernadette.
So yeah, just because of the change in religious life today. Really.
Rachel, have you recovered a voice at all?
No, I can.
Do you feel comfortable, or would you prefer me to say something?
Sure.
No, you talk away if you can.
Rachel, can you hear me? I'm from the United States as well. And I'm doing the MA full time. And I have the MA in Christian spirituality. And I am interested in religious life. I think it's interesting and I'd like to learn more.
Well done, Rachel. Thank you.
Jo Robson, Carmelite nun from a community in Hertfordshire. As a community, but really personally as well, we wanted to touch what is the sort of absolute contemporary thinking in religious life and literature and academic perspective, to bring that in and to know what it is, and also to allow it to dialogue with sort of monastic literature that's around. So that's why I'm here, breaking all the rules of enclosure that there are.
There are always mitigating circumstances,
and my
yes.
prioress does know I'm here.
Yes, quite so.
I've been there in the community 10 years, and up until November I was running the Altar Bread business. We sell communion wafers, so I was running that, and this is what I now call my academic sabbatical.
Excellent. You have a scientific background, don't you, Jo?
Yes.
Yes. I think one thing that comes up, which is interesting, is people, saying they're interested in the kind of the latest, the most up-to-date thinking. The fact is, there hasn't been a huge amount of articulation of the thinking very recently. This is an area that vast amounts of people wrote about in the 1960s, around the time of the Second Vatican Council, when people's ideas about religious life were changing, when the church challenged people to think very differently about religious life. There was an outpouring of writing then. There was quite a lot throughout the 70s and 80s. And then, for a whole variety of reasons that one of the... I'm just going to turn and see. The great thing is never, never, never to write in indelible pen on the screen, because then you get very, very bad marks indeed. A woman whose work is very interesting, Patricia Witt, Berg, is an American sister who is a professor of sociology of religion, and she writes very interestingly from a sociological perspective about why religious life, particularly apostolic religious life for women, has to a large extent disintegrated. I mean, for instance, it's estimated that in the United States of America, 90% of women religious, of apostolic women religious, are now over the age of 75. So whatever happens, by the law of averages in the next 20, 25 years, the kind of demographics in religious life are going to look very different. And so there has been a kind of gradual quietening down of many of the big debates in the first sort of 25 years after the Second Vatican Council. Sandra Schneiders has written some very important and powerful things. The Benedictine Joan Chittister, Barbara Fiand. But these are people who were writing in the 80s and 90s and have written less about this. It's almost as if many of the debates have simply gone quiet by default, or that people just no longer know what to say. And you do get some very important and interesting work, like Patricia Witt Berg's, which are doing sociological studies. Social science studies, you still get quite a bit. You get a lot of literature in the sort of spirituality line. But if you like, theological reflection about what religious life is about and why it's about, its work and its life, and where it might be going, that is where there is quite a big silence. So that's one of the reasons why we've come together to explore this. I want to start, a very good place to start is the Bible. So I asked Rachel, as you all came in, to hand you around basically the vocation story of Peter. There are a number of quite interesting things to do. One very interesting exercise is to go through the Bible and look at vocation stories. So you start with Noah, and you go on to all the judges and the patriarchs, Abraham's and Sarah's call story, Moses' call story, etc. And then you go to the prophets and you look at them, And then you look at Gideon and you look at all these people. Jonah is a cracker to look at, you know. And just look to see, is there any kind of pattern? And it's interesting that Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary of Nazareth, very much conforms to, as did Joseph and Zechariah and Elizabeth, they conform very much to the Old Testament pattern of call literature or call stories. And it's very interesting for yourselves to see what kind of a pattern do you detect of the type of people that God seems to call, the circumstances in which they're called, and their typical response to that call. And whether or not within their story, within the Bible, there is any kind of development to that call. Because there is a very definite, discernible pattern. Well, I decided, rather than to take a kind of global view of the scripture today, to have a look at one particular person, namely Peter. And I don't know if you've had a chance to just glance over. But I'd like to invite you just to take a pen and to maybe jot down a word or two by each paragraph of anything that strikes you about the dynamics of the relationship, the dynamics of the story as you read it. You know, what strikes you particularly about this particular story, this dynamic? And can you give a name, perhaps an adjective, to Peter's dispositions or Peter's reactions? Or it might be a noun, or it might be an adverb. I mean, I don't know why I'm choosing sort of grammatical forms, but can you give a name to what's going on? I'd like to see if you can get down to the bottom of page 2, and then we'll take page 3 as it comes, okay? Okay, let's give it a go and see. Thanks very much, Nadine. Let's give it a go and see if we can see any kind of discernible pattern in the dynamic of the relationship, or in the way in which this sense of call and vocation grows. Any offers on the first paragraph of any words that strike you, or any bit that strikes you very much? Do not be afraid.
Well, there's a dialogue going on.
Yeah.
It's not one way.
It's not a one-way thing, is it? Okay. Yeah.
So, and there's kind of, in the first one anyway, there's a call for trust as well. That's what.
Yeah, absolutely. Any additions to that?
Humility.
Where do you see that?
When he says, "Go away from me."
Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And in many ways, you know, one of the reactions to this sense of being invited is a sense of personal inadequacy, a sense of, you know, why me? I was trying to remember the other day which one it was. It was one of the 18th century French saints who, I can't even remember which order he joined, but anyway, he was canonized, is all I know in the end of it. But when he was a little boy, they've actually got his school book, and it said, this book belongs to, you know, Jean-Francois, whatever his name was, who is not, underlined, going to become a priest. And he was obviously, you know, presumably somebody had said to him, oh, you'd make a good priest. No, I jolly well won't, you know. So that sense of, you know, not me. And it certainly would be the case that one of the patterns that one detects throughout the Bible is of God calling people who either have a deep sense of their own unworthiness, or who actually are the last person alive that you would think of giving a job like that to, you know. Poor old Moses, you know, talk about this film, The King's Speech, you know. Moses couldn't talk. You know, give it to somebody who can at least get his words out, you know. Or people who feel they're too young, or they come from a very lowly tribe, and, you know, why don't you go and ask somebody from the tribe of Judah? I'm sure they'd be much better at this than I would be. So that sense of call involving, in a sense, of its very nature, is already a mirror, a challenging mirror, that makes you look at yourself and say, I'm not getting this call as a kind of good conduct prize. I'm not getting this because I'm the best in the class. And in fact, the call itself is a huge challenge to self-knowledge and to truth and to honesty. Not that the self-knowledge necessarily stops there or even lasts very long in Peter's case, but nevertheless. So, you know, sometimes a sense, you know, even of inadequacy, a sense of real sin. You know, he puts it very bluntly, leave me for I'm a sinful man. So some sense that for a person to be called particularly, to have a vocation, to be called by God, one is entering into what used in the old days to be called the way of perfection. And if you look at the literature about religious life, much of which was written from the 16th century onwards, or even, you know, further back than that, it talks about religious life being a way of perfection. And of course, that's a scary thing to even think about, being called to perfection. And of course, it can be also quite a dangerous thing to think about, because it gives people delusions of grandeur, or it gives them the illusion that, you know, if I go into the monastery, all my problems will somehow be ironed out. And any of us who've lived religious life know that, on the contrary, when you enter the monastery, if anything, the problems are exacerbated because they're seen in their unvarnished form, without any of the smoothing that goes on in ordinary life, where you can at least get away from people and hide. But, for instance, Teresa of Avila wrote a very famous book, Camino de Perfección, called the Way of, or the Road of Perfection, the Path of Perfection. And there is a sense that this is a call to a very, very radical following of God. Okay. And Jesus, however, doesn't appear to be terribly bothered. Can say anybody, any sense of Jesus himself here?
I mean, I was intrigued at the beginning because he actually, I think, elicits help from Peter, and that's how he gets him interested.
Yeah.
I think, how does he hook him?
Yes. I need you.
Yes.
I need you. So that sense also here in discipleship of God actually having need of us. Now, we know that at one level, you know, God can do whatever God wants with a flick of a, you know, eyelash or click of the fingers. But that sense of being needed by God, and I'm thinking of Jamie's major interest in Newman, that famous passage by Newman about having a special vocation. You know, God has some task for me to do, you know, something that I, and in God's providence, I only can do. Now, you know, many people have that sense and don't necessarily have to join a religious order, but that would be very much part of a sense for many people of what draws them into religious life. Okay? Let's have a look as we go further, paragraph 2, the famous walking on the water scene. Any sense of what's going, or the dynamics there?
Desire.
Yep. There's desire. I want to be with you. I want to do what you are asking of me. Enthusiasm.
Sense of weakness.
A sense of weakness. And not only a sense of weakness, but actual weakness. You know, the weakness is genuinely there. So it's an enthusiasm that doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of self-knowledge behind it. And that moves into fear as the whole thing seems to be collapsing. So there is, in a sense, there's a kind of deconstruction going on here, a deconstruction of Peter's sense of self. Yeah.
Followed by reassurance.
It's followed by reassurance, isn't it? So it is a challenge to what's completely unknown and unfamiliar, which is met with love and enthusiasm and desire, but extremely quickly, a genuine realization, I can't do this, but a reassurance of, you don't have to. I'm doing it with you, for you, in you. And it seems to me that that's the dynamic that goes on all the way through the Peter stories. If we look at paragraph 3, again the same thing. Who do people say that I am? The response, faith, love, enthusiasm. You are the Christ, the Son of God. You know, I've got it. So he's got top marks in the class. And that love takes him into denying what Jesus is trying to say about the passion, which reveals yet again a fundamental lack of understanding or lack of insight, which is met by Jesus quite strongly and sharply with a real slap in the face challenge. So again, Peter's world is being deconstructed. The cozy world where we're all going to be friends together and it's all going to be lovely is being deliberately deconstructed, but not in a destructive way, but by Jesus's increasing levels of challenge. So it's as if I often look at this and think, this is Peter doing his novitiate, and the levels of challenge get stronger. And one presumes that Jesus wouldn't do this if he didn't think he could take it. But the levels get stronger about, this isn't what you thought it was about. You aren't who you think you're about. And it is a whole process of growth and transformation, which requires a radical reassessment of his view of how things are, and particularly a radical reassessment of his view of who God is and who he is. So this vocation story hits down into the very heart of who we think we are, who we think God is, and the vocation is itself transformative of our own sense of self and our own sense of God. And without being willing to have our sense of self and our sense of God transformed, we cannot walk the way of Jesus. And the transfiguration, the next paragraph, is the same thing in reverse. Paragraph 3, it's Peter reacting to the bad news. Paragraph 4 is Peter reacting to the good news. And in many sense, both are as scary. This, if you like, is Peter's mystical encounter. I think most of us don't think of Peter as much of a mystic, really, but it is. And this one, they're terrified. And again, the immediate love, enthusiasm, oh great, let's build a tent, let's all stay here, forever. Betraying the fundamental lack of insight as to what this is really about, and the fear and the challenge. Can I look at paragraph 6 with you? The paragraph of the rich young man. What do you see happening in that encounter? What's going on there between Jesus and Peter?
always think of that as the moment when Peter tells Jesus to come up with the goods.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is a kind of mutual relationship, isn't it? And Peter says, well, okay, so far I've done this bonkers thing you've asked me to do. So what's in it for me? And, where's the beef? Who was that? There was some American politician, wasn't it, who went around, you're too young probably to remember. It was he then got into terrible trouble with a girlfriend, as far as I remember, a chap called Hart. It was long ago, it must be at least 20 years ago. But for whatever reason, his campaign slogan was a question that he kept asking people. I don't quite know what he meant by it, but anyway, where's the beef? Mm-hmm. And I think he meant, show us the colour of your money, where's it happening? Let's have a look at what this is about, what do we get out of this? And it seems to me that's a moment where Peter's kind of counting the cost. He's counting the cost of discipleship. Was it Eliot said, costing not less than everything. Well, we've done all these crazy things, taken vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, or whatever they might be. Is there any point to this? And that also, it seems to me, is a very crucial point in the growth and development of a vocation, of looking at the way in which it ceases to be something that is experienced as external, as from the outside in. And certainly any of us who have experience of having entered religious life, either as it is currently now or as it was in previous decades, where there's a huge amount of adaptation from the outside in. Suddenly you were wearing very different clothes. I remember how very difficult I found it to learn to shut doors silently. Aged 18, bang, crash, wallop, And it's a big issue in convents, certainly, or in places where you're trying to develop silence. You learn to move very quietly and not to be obtrusive with those around you. So you're adapting from the outside in the hope that eventually you will internalize these things. And this is almost the moment of that switchover, where Peter is saying, well, we've done all the external things you asked us to do, come on the road, give up our families, give up our livelihoods. And where's that got us exactly? Bless you. And so there is a sense here in this and in all these biblical stories of a continuing relationship, not just a personal relationship, I would say, with Jesus, but a relationship that is paradigmatic, that's a pattern of the relationship of radical discipleship. That is about transformation of the individual, a transformation of their identity, their sense of self, and a transformation of their sense of God. And it's one that eventually, when we get to looking at Peter, both at the end of the Gospel of John, and Peter particularly, I think paragraph 14 is a most extraordinary paragraph to reflect on when you've looked at the earlier paragraphs of this great galumphing Peter. The people laying the sick out in the streets in order that Peter's shadow might fall. And you remember where it says in the scriptures, Jesus says to them, you think these are amazing things, even greater things than these will happen to you. And what we have in the healing stories of Jesus is people reaching out to Jesus and the woman trying to touch the hem of his garment, but at least they're still in contact with Jesus physically. Whereas here, they're not even in contact with Peter physically. It's just his shadow falling on them. But somehow the very shadow of Peter has become a powerful source of light and transformation. It's a very, very big radical change. So I'd like to, invite you at some point, and in some ways this is more of a prayerful exercise than a theological exercise, but to look at these passages in the light of your own sense of call, or your own sense of what it is to be, for someone to be called by God, and see whether, the dynamics, whether you get a sense of the dynamic and the rhythm. I'm conscious that I've talked a great deal about this. We've had some comments from the floor, but would there be anything anyone else would have wanted to say or would have thought about in relation to these particular passages?
One thing that
Yeah.
struck me in several of the passages was this dual dynamic between resistance
Yes.
and desire.
Yes.
That you don't have the desire without also a big sense of, well, I don't really want this either.
Yes, yes. Of wanting but not wanting. Of wanting but not wanting.
And
Or,
even the call.
uh-huh.
Even the call of Peter in the beginning. I mean, he wasn't really in that crowd. He was removed
Yeah.
from the crowd, but obviously had a very listening ear to what was going on round about him, as if he was there, but he didn't really want to be there. Part of him didn't, part of him didn't.
People often do that, don't they? They kind of
Yeah.
slightly hover.
Slightly, yeah.
They sort of hover on the edge,
Hovering, to see.
And it does seem to me that, therefore, the resistance is a very natural reaction, because we see this over and over and over again in the biblical stories of vocation. It is actually one of the abiding bits of the pattern. Even if it's Mary saying, "How can this be? For I know not a man." There's at least a resistance of the imagination, if nothing else there. A resistance to the idea that this could possibly be happening. A resistance for many of those called in the prophetic tradition to, I didn't think I was that kind of a person, And of course, a very kind of charming pattern, particularly we see this in the Call of David, the lovely kind of Jewish pattern of you go right through 7 different people until you get to the right one, So all the big strapping brothers come along, big fellows who look as if they could take anybody on, and it's none of them. And then it's this little weedy lad who's out there, with the sheep, and he's the one, So this pattern of God almost deliberately choosing the unlikely candidate, Therefore, that resistance being an integral part of call and vocation, bless you. And if we look at the history of the founding members of religious orders, we frequently see people who are extraordinarily surprised that they should have been called, or who are not terribly likely. I'm trying to get my memory round John of God, but I think he was a pretty unlikely candidate, wasn't he?
He was,
yeah.
Well, he was a soldier, and he did all sorts of wrong things, but and then eventually he was considered mad, of course.
Yes.
And then he became the great founder because he defied all of the ones that didn't believe in him and wanted to put him out and everything. And he founded the order of, I don't know, many hundred years ago now, 400 or 500.
Yes.
Yeah.
But was in many ways quite a marginal character.
Oh, he was, and he was a bookseller, and they laughed at him, and they put him out everywhere, and he'd be lying on doorsteps, and so an extraordinary beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, we can see that and conflict is no stranger to the founding of religious orders, whether it's the reform of Carmel or, whatever, or the story of my own congregation whose foundress was imprisoned as a heretic for having dared to believe that women could do great things for God, So conflict, resistance, and whether it's conflict and resistance coming from within or from outside, conflict and resistance seem to be an integral part of both a personal vocation and vocations, the growth of charisms within the church. We're not terribly good in the church at dealing with the unfamiliar and the unexpected. And by and large, nor, according to the biblical narratives, are people terribly good at dealing with a God who acts in a way that is unfamiliar and unexpected. I'm going to stop there for a moment because we really do need a break. For the two principal paradigms from the Bible that are used by religious to describe themselves. One is prophetic, and people often talk about the religious life as being part of the prophetic arm of the church, if you like, the prophetic part of the church. And the other is that in a great deal of the literature that emanates from religious themselves, particularly the mystical literature that comes out of religious life, there is a great deal of spousal imagery. And interestingly, not just of women religious talking about themselves in relation to Jesus, but religious talking about themselves in relation to the church, and male religious also talking about religious life in spousal terms, which of course is quite challenging in itself. And in some ways I'm rather sad not to have any men religious here, because it would be very interesting to hear what they make of all of this. So the first thing I'd like to suggest you do, and maybe because you're a 3 on this side and a 3 on that side, is to get together in a little huddle of 3 and to look at, what do you think it means when people talk about religious life as being part of the prophetic side of the church, or being part of the prophetic movement within the church? Because it's become a bit of a cliche, I think, among religious. Oh, we're all very prophetic. Well, maybe we are. But in which case, what does that actually mean? And I'd like you to look, first of all, at that question kind of on its own merits. But then I'd like to ask you to look very briefly at, what do you understand prophetic to mean in biblical terms? What did the Bible mean by prophetic? So do these two concepts fit with each other? Do they match? And in the same way, when you've done that, I'd like you just to look at the whole notion of spousal imagery. We typically take, the Song of Songs. St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote great treatises about the Song of Songs. Interesting, a man writing, the voice of my beloved, he comes leaping over the hills. And what's that all about? And, is that a helpful image for you? Or would you see it as one? Or would you see it as something, well, it's all very well, it's lovely, we've got a Carmelite here. This is the kind of thing Carmelites go on about, spousal image, but, for us kind of, down and dirty types who are kind of, getting our hands dirty in the marketplace, we've got no time for that. Or is there actually something there that is very important and foundational? So I'm going to give you kind of 5-10 minutes just to kind of natter among yourselves about that, and then see if we can pull some ideas together. Okay? Over to you. And please, just one thing I need to say, there is no such thing as a stupid question. There is no such thing as a stupid idea. So pull them all and see where you go. Okay?
Give it a test.
It's running out.
Yeah, okay.
Is there a plug somewhere I can just,
More, is it?
while we talk?
A plug. Yes, if you heave it to me, I shall.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Oh, I mean, what about-
Yeah.
Finish. The end.
We haven't moved to spousal.
Okay, worry not about it. We'll leave the spouses for another time.
We had no spouses here.
We had no spouses there either. No. Okay, so anything in very brief to look at, the relevance or otherwise of the notion of prophecy and being prophetic for religious life from anybody?
Well, I think it's very interesting that many religious, I think, are comfortable with the idea that religious life is prophetic.
Yes.
But I mean, my memory is that before Vatican II, that just didn't really exist. You know, that was not the way that religious thought of themselves.
I wonder if that is part and parcel of the fact that Catholics weren't desperately switched on to the Bible before the Second Vatican Council in a very significant way.
But in terms of a sense of identity,
Yes, yes.
theological understanding
Yes.
of what I'm doing,
Yes. That wasn't a very common metaphor for religious life, was it?
No.
No. And therefore, why do you think it changed?
Well, it certainly changed as a result of Vatican II. And I think I would say, and maybe I'm being negative on this, because Vatican II promotes the sense of holiness for everybody,
Yes.
it did religious out of a row.
Yes. The sense of the universal call to holiness, and we are going to be looking at that when we look more at religious life in terms of ecclesiology and where and how religious life fits within the church, with a reform that placed an immense emphasis on the principal vocation being that of baptism, and on religious life, and on all baptized persons, and in fact all human beings, being called to a vocation of holiness. If holiness was the strong currency that religious traded in, then suddenly we were bankrupt, you know, because everybody else was trading in it too. And so perhaps, and this of course takes us back to one of the aspects of the origins of religious life in the very beginning of the church anyway, of the first couple of hundred years of the church's life. The radical option was to die for Christ. The radical option was martyrdom, faithfulness unto death. And when the Christian church became part and parcel of the Roman Empire, and with the Constantinian, when under Emperor Constantine, the Christianity became like the religion of the Roman Empire. Well, all of a sudden it was respectable to be Christian. And that was when those who felt themselves called to a more radical living out of the Christian faith found themselves on the side of the conformists, and this was no good. So off they all fled to the desert to abandon, you know, possessions and exclusive relationships and positions of power in order to live in what came to be known as poverty, chastity, and obedience, in one way or another. So maybe, you know, there is an element to, if, in a sense, if everybody's everybody, nobody is somebody. And so when everybody is called to holiness, then while everyone's pursuing that, there is nevertheless a sense of rebels looking for a cause. And here we find it in the prophetic role. Well, that brings us very neatly on to some material that I want to give you to look at. Now, I don't apologise for the fact that it's slightly scrappy in the sense that I'm giving you 2 or 3 pages here or there. And I am very grateful to the wonderful Dr. Jenny Dines, who is a canoness of St. Augustine and used to teach in this august establishment, for much of the thinking behind this. This just gives you an idea of some seminal texts. Now, it points you to the Vatican II documents. You can find them on the web if you don't have them at home. So all you've got to do is Google the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church and just have a look at the paragraphs, because it talks about biblical models and it shows you what the Second Vatican Council thought of as the biblical models for religious life. And the biblical images that are used in Perfecte Caritatis, the specific decree on religious life. Okay. But I'm also going to give you some bits and pieces where different authors are looking either at the notion of prophetic, just one each of those, prophetic, religious life as prophetic, or the notion of spousal imagery, particularly with regard to the vow of celibacy. So I hope you don't get too overwhelmed by the thought, oh, she's giving us so much, but I'm giving you kind of 2 or 3 pages at a time. So it's in bite-sized chunks. Okay. Now. And some of this is just asking you to look at, well, how do we understand prophecy in the Bible, and how might such a word be used effectively of religious life? That's Michael Crosby. And if it begins in the middle of a paragraph, the idea is that you start on where a new paragraph begins. You see what I mean? And I may sometimes only just give you 1 page because it's just pointing to a particular question that's of interest. Now, I have one bit of... that was Michael... this is another bit from Michael Crosby. 2 of them, don't worry that 2 of them say they're from Sandra Schneider's and 2 of them say they're from Michael Crosby. They're just different paragraphs or different snippets from the same book. And I do recommend that you keep a file, because then you'll be able to... one last thing, this is the sort of thing that happens rather randomly at Heythrop, but I just found it so very helpful. Is this Sister Sandra Schneider's? Yes, it is. That's 1 page, I think, of Schneider's there. That's the extra page of Schneider's. 1, 2, and 3. That's an extra page of Schneider's. I happened to be talking to the principal, John McDade, about this class, and he said, do you know, I've just read the most fabulous thing about the Essenes and how the Essene movement was the beginning of, is thought by the writer of this book, a man called Boccaccini, to be actually the origin of Christianity itself, but also how one might see it as the origin of a rather radical following of God, which has a great relevance to religious life. So if you have the time, you might find it useful. Here, the bit I've just given you is John's summary of what Boccaccini is saying, and then he gives you a chapter of Boccaccini where he talks about the Essenes. You might not be able to read this in time for next week, but you might like to just keep it about you because it's a jolly interesting notion. Because you probably have come across the notion before that John the Baptist had links with the Essene movement, and there are indeed theories that Jesus himself had links with the Essene movement. It remains to be seen whether we accept that as a theory or not. What I would do is ask you for next week, please, to have read all the other little bits, both about about prophecy in the scriptures and how we understand prophecy. Because what I'd like us to get down to is, you know, what are the characteristics of prophecy that are actually in the Bible? And are they genuinely relevant? Can they be genuinely and correctly used with regard to religious life? If so, why? If not, why not? Or do we perhaps need to just reconfigure that? One last little word. Maureen was interestingly saying in the discussion that she didn't really like terribly the idea of people of religious saying, or at least implying, "Ooh, I'm so prophetic and I'm so amazing and wonderful. Look at me," you know. Which, quite right too, and it reminds one of the the Pharisees with the tassels and the broad phylacteries and whatever. I don't know if any of you have seen a film that has been on since December called Of Gods and Men. If you have not, I urgently recommend you to go and see it. It's in French but reasonably subtitled, and it's coming out on DVD soon.
We're waiting, we're on the list.
It is the most fabulous film. It's on certainly at the Curzon Cinema here in London in Mayfair. The story is of the Trappist monks of Tibérine in Algeria who lived their vow of stability to the radical end, and who died for it. What you do not in any sense get in that film is a group of monks who are saying to themselves, to each other, to the church, or indeed to their Muslim neighbours, "Ooh, look at us, ain't we great?" But you are getting people who are choosing very consciously, at huge cost to themselves, radical fidelity to what they have been called to and what they have vowed. Now, I would see that as being exercising the prophetic dimension in a way that is eminently quiet and humble, but eminently powerful. So maybe that's a kind of, not, Maureen, an either or, but a both and. Having looked a little bit then at the prophetic image, let's have a look at spousal imagery. And again, I'm just going to talk a little bit about that and then see what you make of all of this. Now, obviously, spousal imagery is very much part of the mystical tradition. And it uses love imagery, quite erotic love imagery, both as found in the Song of Songs in the Bible, and indeed found in the mystical writings of people like John of the Cross. To describe the fundamental dynamic of love in the relationship between the person called and God, and very often God embodied in Jesus Christ. And you've only got to think of the famous statue in Rome, Bellini? It's Bellini, of the ecstasy of Teresa of Avila. Extraordinary piece of very, very passionate and dynamic and erotic sculpture that nevertheless tries to convey something of the overwhelming and profound personal relationship between the lover and the beloved. If we look at spousal imagery in the Bible, it's not just a sort of one-to-one relationship. I wonder if any of you can, in your heads, remember any mention of, any reference to spousal love in the scriptures. You don't have to give the chapter and verse for it, so don't panic. But if you can remember any references and see, what do they seem to be references to? So it's God referring to Israel as his bride. So it's about God and the community. It's about God and God's people. And as a young man marries a bride, so will I marry you. You know, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have called you and you are mine. So there is a very specific link in the Old Testament between references to spousal love and to covenant, and to the covenant between God and Israel, God and the whole people, God and the whole community. And where the initiative, if you like, the spousal initiative comes from, is from God principally, and not from us, not from the individual, from the person. So it would appear to be something of the characteristic of the way in which God approaches the people God wishes to make God's own. That is spousal and intimate. In what other way would you see spousal love being a metaphor in the Bible? I don't know if any of you can think of the frequent references to spousal relationship, either in Hosea or in Ezekiel, for instance. What are those references about? They're about fidelity and infidelity. There's a whole dynamic of the unfaithful spouse and of God being, if you like, the seducer. There's that wonderful bit in it's Jeremiah, you know, you have seduced me, O God, and I have let myself be seduced. Or the passage in Hosea where God says, I will lead her out into the wilderness, I will lure her out into the wilderness, and I will betroth her to me as I betrothed her of old. So there's a whole drama going on within prophetic literature about the faithful God, God's longing for Israel, and Israel playing the field, Israel playing around. So maybe whatever is going on there is not just about a kind of lovey-dovey, stars in their eyes, personal relationship, but about something much more challenging and radical, about God's relationship with the people with whom God makes a covenant. Now again, a question to you would be, how do we understand, if that's what we're looking at, what sense, if any, does it make to have so much reference to spousal love with regard to religious life? Is it that we're just trying to fit something rather awkwardly in that doesn't really work? Or is there an aspect to this that we correctly are drawn to when we think about the religious life, the consecrated life? Because it's being touched on in a profound way by these kinds of images. Because as I said to you before, if all we're looking at is some sort of romanticized view of the love relationship between God and the human person, it raises some quite interesting questions when male religious try to use this imagery. So, you know, what might be the positives, the helpful nature of this kind of imagery to use about religious life, and what might be some of the challenges? Let me give you another couple of minutes, both to think of that for yourself and then to talk about it among yourselves.
what you think of it.
So I suppose that's an act of love for, yeah, I mean, I guess that's it's also a very different way of seeing things.
Is it challenging us to think of love and the erotic element of that?
Lovely. We're going to... Can I bring you back just for a moment? Yes. Okay. So, where have we got with spousal love and the spousal imagery? Does it work for religious life? Or is it just something that has been kind of borrowed, which might fit better elsewhere?
My own experience on that one, I don't know if it's relevant, coming in, I was kind of like this modern woman who was not going to have spousal imagery forced down my throat, John of the Cross or no John of the Cross. And I really resisted. I said, let's do this in terms of friendship. That's a good image for me. And I have found that you can't actually do without it, that it's articulating a truth that you need. Or that is essential. It's just there. You can't say I'm going to dislocate it. So if we have problems with the image, maybe it's more how we understand the image rather than how we understand the essence of what the image is trying to get at.
Can you say a bit more about why you think we need it in religious life? Why those kinds of images are needed?
I think it articulates a truth that nothing else.
What kind of a truth?
The truth about the emerging intimacy with God, the radical dependency on God, the oneness, that sounds like I've achieved union, but that God becomes the sole focus, and in the end all the other things you find you have to jettison.
And maybe I think that is putting a finger very, very firmly on one, therefore, of the central identifying characteristics of the consecrated life, of religious life. Not in terms of it being kind of morally or in some other way superior, but that it is the single focus. It's a question of God being the principal and single focus. And therefore, this particular metaphor becomes the best available metaphor there is for what actually happens. So despite ourselves, we find ourselves using it because it does become the best descriptor there is of something that is an essential part of the package that is religious life. Whether we like it or not. Whether we like it or not. And of course, a lot of modern women don't like it because marriage has all, and spousal relationships have all sorts of ambivalences about them. And certainly if you've been brought up in a kind of postmodern feminist world, there are, this is problematic. And therefore, presumably, also problematic if you're coming at this from a male perspective, but it nevertheless, the bond remains the same of that unique focus. So maybe it works better than we think. What did this group here? What came out of your own deliberations?
I think we were fairly ambivalent. But I was thinking there's something about religious life as if and I was thinking of the way of perfection.
Yes.
This pathway of transformation. And I think that the objective of union with God. I would say I don't see any other way really of describing it, or any other language that you can use for that.
Jamie, how did that sound to you as being the token male in the room?
Well, I guess I was quite interested. It seems that this metaphor is used in two very broadly very different ways. You have the Song of Songs, which perhaps is, well, it has been interpreted in a union, a union kind of way, which is what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Then you also have the prophetical ones where there's, it's not a sense of union you get in lots of songs. You get a continual turning away and turning back. And so I was kind of quite interested in how broadly that image can be used. You both have perhaps the aim of a religious life and also the difficulty and complexity of living one.
So the complexity of both the almost contradictory dynamic of the aim and the reality, the desire, and we're back to Peter all over again, aren't we? We're back to the fact that integral to the call, integral to the desire, integral to the response is nevertheless also a resistance. And actually, even if you take the Song of Songs, if you look at the storyline in the Song of Songs, it's not just about union, it's also about separation. The story in the Song of Songs is about the lover who departs and who cannot be found. And, I sought in the streets, him whom my soul loves. I sought but didn't find him. Now, many of the mystics have ended up using that as a very helpful way of describing the dynamic of prayer, where with the best will and the best intention of the world, we settle ourselves down for the party and nobody turns up, or so it seems. And so there's a great deal about the relationship of prayer that goes on in using those words. But it's also perhaps about God seeking us and we don't turn up, And therefore that dynamic, that covenantal relationship, not only perhaps of the individual and God, but it's worth reflecting on the fact that in most instances, religious life has arisen in the church at a time of some sort of crisis within the church or within society. And religious life has very often been part of a general renewal movement. The charisms of religious life emerging have very often been either in response to a historical crisis within society, whether, for instance, it might be the French Revolution and the widespread collapse of faith and faith practice and church structures, or the rise of the cities in the Middle Ages and the need for something other than the monastic life to respond to the needs of the people, and therefore the rise of the mendicant orders, the rise of many of the women's religious orders in the 19th century as a response to the industrial age and the changes in society, the need for education, nursing, care of the sick and the poor and the elderly. But very often also, even with all these things, religious life has arisen as a response to a felt need within the church for something to breathe life into it again. And if you think of, for instance, the famous dream of Pope Innocent III, he dreamt of a little man in a brown robe holding up the church, and there's a very famous painting. I'm trying to think, I think it's Giotto, isn't it? Of Francis quite literally holding up the church, a collapsing church with his shoulder. And Francis himself going into the ruined chapel of San Damiano and hearing God saying, "Francis, rebuild my church." And he thought that God was telling him to get down with the bricks and mortar. And of course, in one way he was, and that was the beginning of the Franciscan movement. But it was also in a much broader sense the idea of the Franciscan Charism, which swept across Europe and swept kings and princes and queens and duchesses, as well as peasants and merchants, into its wake. People, lay people as well as religious, finding their way to a renewal of the life of the Spirit through the Franciscan Charism. And so that sense of spousal love being part of a relationship of fidelity where God is constantly trying to lure and attract the people back to their original covenant. And through perhaps the charisms of religious life, this is one of the ways in which it happens. So it's part, if we look ecclesiologically at the religious life, it's part of a constantly renewed pattern of call and response in different ages in relation to different contexts, different social, historical and ecclesial contexts. So I hope you'll enjoy reading the passages, because I think it might give you a very different way of looking at this. And it's worth perhaps asking yourselves, those of you who are religious, is there any kind of reference either to prophecy or to spousal relationship within your foundational texts or within the story of your founder or foundress? And how does that work out for you now? How has that emerged and developed within the history of your own order? The two of you who are not religious, perhaps to look at the biblical passages and see, well, what does that say to you as a person who's not a religious? Does it have any relevance for you personally? And if so, how does that work? But also, can you see it as being something that fits with your understanding, your perception from the outside of religious life and the way that it operates? There was a famous Australian soap, wasn't there, called Brides of Christ, which was all about, I think, girls in a Catholic convent school in Australia in the 1950s. And do the Carmelites still wear a wedding dress on their clothing day? No.
That went out about 20 or 30 years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah. Because I don't know if there still are any, but certainly many of the monastic orders, and indeed actually certainly my own congregation, or parts of it, certainly our Korean sisters were still all wearing wedding dresses on their clothing day until relatively recently, certainly about 20, 30 years ago.
Did it stop?
After that, I think.
And did your sisters do the same?
They did,
yeah.
yeah.
And I remember also, because one of our sisters who had a sister in your congregation, ours was Sister Stephen Colleran. She had a sister who was a sister of Nazareth. And I remember seeing a photo of her on her Golden Jubilee, and she wore a crown, she wore
I can remember
a
the
wreath.
sisters on and had a staff.
and a staff and a wreath and for their Golden
Yeah,
Jubilee
I
also.
remember
Would
that,
your
yeah.
sisters have
We
worn
did that.
wedding dress
Yeah.
and stuff?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
no. Some congregations did and some didn't.
Why did it stop?
Why did it stop? I think kind of culture swept it away, didn't it? Did you have a deliberate decision, we're not going to do this anymore?
I think there was a sense, because it happened on your clothing day, which actually isn't a day of definitive decision.
That's right. I think
There was a lot of fuss around clothing, and then a couple of weeks later people left, and it began to, I think there was a shift to seeing solemn profession as that absolute definitive moment.
Yes.
Where if there was going to be any bridal imagery, it would be more appropriate there, and by that point it wasn't appropriate anyway. So it was kind of about that shift between of emphasis between clothing and solemn vows.
I think they still, though, certainly if you go onto the Eternal Word Network, Mother Angelica's network, I think they still have clothings and things there, and certainly there was a time, I don't know if still are, where there was still a great deal of bridal imagery going on.
Yeah.
I think for many now, and of course for a great many religious orders, there is no longer a transition from secular clothes into religious habit, and therefore because the bridal gown was seen as a sort of transition from one to the other, and when that stopped, you kind of lost part of the metaphor really, and so the metaphor collapsed.